There's a moment, and I think anyone who was there will tell you the same thing, where the whole hangar just went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where someone drops something and everybody looks up. I mean the kind of quiet where 2,000 beings from 14 different species all stop breathing at the exact same time, where the air itself seems to hold still, where even the recycled atmosphere pumping through the ventilation ducts sounds too loud. That kind of quiet. And in the middle of it, standing on a painted yellow line on a scuffed Durasteel floor, was a 23-year-old kid from Tulsa, Oklahoma named Marcus Webb, rolling his neck like he was warming up for a backyard pickup game. He had no idea what he'd started. None of us did really, not yet. Chapter 1, How We Got Here. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without context, and the context is honestly almost as strange as what happened. My name is Sergeant First Class Delia Okonkwo, and at the time of this story I was stationed aboard the GCS Meridian Compact, a joint species diplomatic and military coordination vessel roughly the size of a small city. 17 decks, 9,000 crew members from across the Galactic Cooperative, and 412 humans, representing the newest, smallest, and widely considered most baffling species to have achieved Tier 3 contact status in recorded history. We'd been out here 18 months by then. 18 months of what the Cooperative officially called Integration Protocol. What that actually meant in practice was that humans were being evaluated, watched, measured against standards developed over centuries of contact with species who'd had thousands of years to figure out space travel, warfare, diplomacy, and every other thing that matters when you're trying to not get eaten or ignored or accidentally offended into a war. The Cathara were our primary evaluators, big, serious, gray-skinned with 4 arms and a sensory cluster where humans have a nose. They'd been spacefaring for 600 years. They had a word in their language that roughly translated to the patience required to watch a new species try. It was a compound word. They used it a lot when they were around us. The Vrelian Accord, which everyone just called the Vrelians, were the second group doing the evaluating. They were tall and insectal, with compound eyes that could track 17 separate visual fields simultaneously. Beautiful in a way that made your skin feel funny. They handled most of the tactical and military assessment, which meant they spent a lot of time watching humans train, run drills, maintain equipment, and generally try to keep up with species that had been refining combat doctrine before Earth had agriculture. And then there was Commander HFY Sci-Fi of the Serath Compact, a being I genuinely liked, despite the fact that he communicated primarily through bioluminescent skin patterns and required a translation buffer the size of a refrigerator to have a conversation. G.H. Ross had been the first senior officer on the Meridian Compact to advocate for extending the integration timeline. He thought humans were interesting, the kind of interesting that made other officers nervous. "They do not behave predictably," he said once through his buffer. "This is either catastrophic or valuable. I have not yet decided which." 18 months in, I think he was starting to lean toward valuable. But only barely. Because here's the thing about humans in the Galactic Cooperative, circa this particular mission. We were behind on everything. Our ships were slower, our weapons were less precise, our battlesuits, which we were incredibly proud of because they represented 40 years of military R&D and the combined engineering genius of 11 nations, were considered roughly equivalent to what the Cathara used for construction work. Our tactical processing was slower. Our reflexes, while considered impressive for our biology, were not remarkable by galactic standards. Our endurance in standard atmospheric conditions was decent. Our communication protocols had 17 acknowledged inefficiencies that Vrelian analysts had documented in a report that our commanding officer, Colonel Adriana Voss, had read exactly once, and then sat down very carefully and stared at the wall for a while. We were, to put it plainly, the new kids, and not in the charming way. In the way where everyone is politely waiting to see if you embarrass yourself badly enough that they have to have a difficult conversation about whether you should be here at all. There had already been 2 formal reviews of human integration fitness. We'd passed both, but not by margins that inspired confidence. The Vrelian tactical report following our 3rd joint training exercise used the phrase marginally acceptable performance envelope 4 times. Our liaison officer, a Cathara named Sesmaravan, had started including a section in his weekly reports titled Notable Human Deficiencies, that was consistently the longest section. The 412 of us aboard the Meridian Compact were carrying the weight of 8 billion people back home who had no idea any of this was happening. No pressure. I'm telling you all of this so you understand the atmosphere when Marcus Webb rolled his neck on that yellow line. It wasn't just a kid limbering up. It was, though none of us fully understood it yet, the beginning of the moment when humans stopped being evaluated and started being seen. The competition started, as most significant human moments do, with boredom and a bad idea. It was a rest cycle, 72 hours of scheduled downtime following a multi-species tactical exercise that had gone, let's say, mixed. Humans had performed adequately in the formation drills. We'd struggled in the long-range targeting simulations. We'd done unexpectedly well in the close-quarters scenario, which had surprised the Vrelian observers enough that they'd asked us to repeat it twice, watching with all 17 visual fields engaged. Their compound eyes rotating in that way that meant they were confused and trying not to show it. During rest cycles, the various species aboard the Meridian Compact did what their species did. The Cathara went into their shared meditation chambers for synchronized neural rest. The Vrelians conducted grooming rituals and reviewed tactical recordings. Several of the smaller species, the Peloran, the Getty, the ones we just called the Blue Guys because their name in their own language required throat structures humans don't have, gathered in their respective cultural spaces for communal activities, we were politely not invited to observe. Humans went to Hangar Bay 7. Hangar Bay 7 was where our equipment was stored and maintained. It was also, informally, where we went to be humans when no one was watching. We dragged in a couple of mismatched chairs. Someone had figured out how to pipe music through the cargo bay's speaker system, which had required unauthorized modifications that Colonel Voss technically didn't know about. There was a corner where people played cards. Another corner where the engineers had set up a kind of informal workshop, where they tinkered with things that weren't broken just because they couldn't help themselves. And then there was the strip. The strip was just a cleared section of the hangar floor, maybe 30 meters long. Someone, I think it was Corporal Jamie Nakagawa, had found some yellow hazard paint in a supply closet and marked out lanes. Just 2 of them, because all it takes is 2 lanes and 2 people, and suddenly you've got something to argue about. It had started small, sprints, who was fastest over 30 meters. Then someone brought a weight bar from the equipment locker and it turned into a lifting competition. Then someone said, "Okay, but what about this?" and demonstrated a movement that turned into a gymnastics argument. Then someone said, "That's nothing, watch this," and the argument escalated. By the time I arrived at Hangar Bay 7 during that rest cycle, about 80 of our 412 humans were gathered around the strip, and Marcus Webb was standing at one end with his hands on his hips, and Specialist Yolanda Ferreira was at the other end with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And it was completely unclear what they were about to do, but everyone was very invested in it. I found Lieutenant Chen standing at the edge of the crowd and asked him what was happening. "Okay, so," he said, "Webb says he can carry Ferreira across the full 30 meters in under 45 seconds. I stared at him. She's 130, he's 190. She says he can't do it in under a minute. There's a betting pool. There's a who started a betting pool. Kim started a betting pool. Of course, Sergeant Kim started a betting pool. And what's the prize? The loser does the winner's equipment maintenance for 2 weeks. I rubbed my eyes. We're on an intergalactic diplomatic and military vessel in the middle of a species-wide evaluation, and we're doing this. Yes, Sergeant. All right, I found a place to stand. Who's winning the pool? What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that 3 Vrelian observers had been in Hangar Bay 7 when we arrived. The Vrelians performed what their doctrine called ambient behavioral sampling during rest cycles. Basically, they'd assign junior observers to quietly monitor non-human species during downtime and document what they found. It was considered important tactical intelligence. Understanding how a species behaved when it thought no one was watching told you things about them that formal exercises never could. The 3 Vrelians assigned to sample us that rest cycle were Sub-Analyst Vreth Call, Sub-Analyst Pressavai, and their supervising senior, Field Analyst Joss Murren, who was filing her 15th report on human behavioral patterns and had developed what her colleagues described as a complicated relationship with her subject matter. They were in the high observation corridor above Hangar Bay 7, a narrow walkway behind tinted panels that were essentially one-way glass. Standard observation setup. We couldn't see them. They could see everything. I know all of this because Joss Murren eventually wrote a report about what she witnessed during that rest cycle that circulated through the entire senior staff and eventually reached Colonel Voss's desk, and made a grown woman who had survived 3 wars and 2 court-martials sit very quietly at her desk, with an expression nobody could read. Joss Murren's report began with the line, "I am not certain my previous behavioral models for the human species are adequate." Coming from a field analyst with 12 years of xenobehavioral observation experience, that was a significant statement. Marcus Webb did the carry in 38 seconds. The noise that went up from 80 humans in a metal hangar was, I'm told, audible in the corridor outside. Yolanda Ferreira, to her credit, was laughing by the time he set her down, and immediately said, "Okay, but now I'm doing you," which produced the kind of anticipatory crowd noise that you only get when people genuinely aren't sure what's about to happen. She carried him in 41 seconds. He was taller and heavier. The crowd lost its mind. And then, because this is what humans do, because this is what we always do, someone said, "Okay, but what if there were obstacles?" And within 20 minutes we had an obstacle carry relay happening in Hangar Bay 7 that involved 4 teams, improvised barriers made from equipment crates, a rule about touching the wall that nobody had written down but everyone agreed on, and a dispute about whether Specialist Tor's carry technique was legal that became a 3-person argument while the relay continued around them. It was chaotic, it was loud. It was, by any reasonable external metric, slightly insane. Above us, behind their tinted panels, 3 Vrelian analysts were watching in complete silence. Chapter 2, The Thing About Humans and Competition. Here's what I think, for whatever my observation is worth. Humans don't just compete. That's too simple a word for what we do. What we actually do is transform competition. We take it, and we layer it with narrative and emotion and social meaning until it becomes something that isn't about winning at all. It's about, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a psychology textbook, about seeing each other, about measuring yourself against something real, about that moment when you push past what you thought your limit was and somebody else witnesses it. I've thought about this a lot since everything that happened, why the Vrelians were so thrown by what they saw. Why G.H. Ross Ivelin asked me to explain it to him 3 separate times and still said he felt like he was missing something. Why Cess Maravan, who had been documenting our deficiencies for 18 months, sat quietly in my office after it was all over and said, in his measured Cathara way, "I believe I may have been measuring the wrong things." It's because they'd been watching us compete in their framework. Formal exercises, timed drills, standardized assessments. And in that framework, yeah, we were behind, we were slower, less precise, less refined. But when we compete for ourselves, when it's just humans in a room with a problem and a way to measure who's best at solving it, something different happens. The obstacle relay went for about 2 hours. By the end of it, the course had been revised 6 times. 3 new rules had been added. 1 rule had been abolished by popular vote. And there was a legitimate philosophical debate happening in one corner about whether the challenge was fundamentally about strength or endurance or strategy, which sounds pretentious, but was actually just specialist os, making a point about whether the route choice mattered more than the carry capacity, and he wasn't wrong. By the time it wound down, people were sweaty and laughing, and someone had produced ration bars from somewhere and was handing them around. The energy in the hangar had that specific quality that comes after good physical effort, warm and satisfied, and a little bit floaty. People were reviewing what had happened, dissecting it, already talking about what they'd do differently next time. Marcus Webb, who had started this whole thing, was sitting on an equipment crate with his shirt over his shoulder, eating a ration bar and grinning at something Ferreira was saying. He looked completely unremarkable. 23 years old, medium height, the kind of build that comes from actual work rather than deliberate training. He looked like a million other kids from a million other places. He had no idea that 3 Vrelian observers above him were experiencing what their psychology would later classify as a fundamental reorientation event. Joss Murren's report detailed what she had observed in clinical field analyst language, but you could feel the something underneath in every paragraph. She described the progression of the competition, the spontaneous rule development, the crowd behavior, how humans who weren't competing were as invested as those who were. How the energy in the room created what she called a collective intensity field that she'd previously only documented in Vrelian ritual combat contexts. She noted the laughter, specifically that human laughter during competition didn't indicate diminishment of seriousness, but appeared to coexist with maximum effort in a way that her behavioral models had classified as contradictory. She noted the dispute resolution, how when there was a disagreement about rules, humans didn't defer to rank. She specifically called out that a sergeant and a specialist had argued with equal intensity, and the sergeant hadn't simply overridden. They'd argued it out and reached something that satisfied both of them enough to proceed. She noted the recovery behavior, how humans who'd pushed themselves to visible exhaustion recovered their baseline within minutes, returning to activity with what she described as apparent enthusiasm that my instruments registered as genuine. And she noted what happened at the end, the thing she flagged as behaviorally anomalous. When the relay was over and a team had been declared the winner, Marcus Webb's team, by the way, which he celebrated by doing a victory lap of the hangar at a jog while everyone yelled at him, which is maybe the most Marcus Webb thing possible, the losing teams didn't leave. They didn't display the conflict reduction behaviors that typically follow competitive defeat. They didn't retreat. They didn't defer. They challenged the winners to do it again. Different format, different terms. They'd learned from what happened and they wanted another shot. And Marcus Webb, who had just won, who had every reason to be done for the day, who was sweaty and tired and eating a ration bar, Marcus Webb said, "Yeah, let's go," and set down his ration bar and stood up. Joss Murren ended that section of her report with a single line that became, in our circles, something close to famous. "I am recording this for the first time in my career. I do not know what I am looking at." Chapter 3, when they started paying attention. Word travels on a ship, even a ship the size of a small city, especially a ship where multiple species are trying to understand each other, and information about behavior is considered tactically relevant by at least 3 separate intelligence-gathering frameworks. By the following morning, or what passed for morning on a vessel that maintained artificial day-night cycles, Joss Murren's preliminary report had reached Field Commander Vethossel, who led the Vrelian contingent aboard the Meridian Compact. I've met Vethossel. He is the kind of being who makes you feel like you're being measured every second you're in his presence, not in a threatening way, in the way that a very precise instrument makes you feel when you stand next to it. He had 17 years in field command, combat experience across 4 conflict engagements, and a reputation among his own people for an analytical clarity that bordered on the unsettling. He read Joss Murren's preliminary report. Then he requested the full observational footage from Hangar Bay 7. Then, and this is the part that I find remarkable, he requested a second meeting with Colonel Voss. Their previous meetings had been professional, formal, efficient, the kind of meetings where everything said is measured carefully and nothing is wasted. Vethossel was not a being who asked for extra meetings. Colonel Voss told me later that he came in, sat down, and said, "I have a question about human competitive behavior that my existing frameworks cannot answer satisfactorily." She said she took a breath, because that sentence from that being was about as far from normal as anything that had happened in 18 months. "Ask," she said, "why do humans who have lost a competition immediately seek to compete again? In my species' understanding, competition concludes when a hierarchy is established. The outcome provides information. Further competition is redundant unless the hierarchy needs correction." Voss said she thought about it for a while. "It's not about the hierarchy," she said finally. "It's about the game." Vethossel's compound eyes rotated. "Clarify." "For us, and I know this is going to sound strange, winning isn't always the point. Sometimes the point is seeing how good you can get, and you can only figure that out by competing. Losing tells you something about where you still need to grow. So losing isn't a conclusion, it's information for the next attempt." The field commander was quiet for a moment. "You compete to learn." "Sometimes. And the one who wins also learns. Especially the one who wins. because now they know someone's coming for them. Another pause. "This is not efficient," Vethossel said. "No," Voss agreed, "it really isn't." "And yet," he said, and paused again, in the way that beings pause when they're processing something that doesn't fit their previous model. "You have maintained this behavior across your entire species' documented history." "Pretty much, yeah." He left without saying anything else, but he stopped in the doorway just for a second and said, "I would like to observe the next instance." News that the Vrelian field commander wanted to observe a human activity spread through the ship in about 4 hours. Which meant that when Marcus Webb, Yolanda Ferreira, and approximately 90 other humans showed up to Hangar Bay 7 for what had spontaneously become Day 2 of whatever this was, they walked in to find that Vethossel and 4 senior Vrelian officers were already there. Not in the observation corridor. In the hangar, standing to one side, in the open, present. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Humans filed in and registered the observers, and there was a ripple of something, not exactly nervousness, but heightened awareness. That particular alertness that comes when you realize someone important is watching. Marcus Webb walked in, saw Vethossel, and I was there for this. I watched it happen, tilted his head slightly to the side in the way he did when he was recalibrating. Then he looked at the painted lines on the floor, then back at Vethossel. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a performing smile, a genuine one, the kind that said, "Oh, this just got interesting." He walked over to where the field commander was standing. Vethossel was 20 centimeters taller than Marcus, and had the combat bearing of someone who'd been built by a civilization that had been refining warfare for half a millennium. Marcus Webb from Tulsa, Oklahoma looked up at him and said, "You want to watch or you want to play?" I heard someone near me inhale very sharply. Vethossel's compound eyes held on him for a long moment. The translation buffer that was following the senior Vrelian officers around rendered Marcus's words in the standard interface language. I watched the field commander process it. "Explain the parameters," Vethossel said. "We figure out what we're doing and then we do it and someone wins," Marcus said. "Parameters kind of build themselves." Another long pause. "This is acceptable," Vethossel said. And that was, if I had to pick a single moment, that was the moment everything changed. Chapter 4, Building the GAMES. Here is where I want to be precise, because what happened next is something I've described probably 100 times, and I always feel like I'm not quite capturing it. The humans in Hangar Bay 7 didn't put on a show. That's the thing. They weren't performing for the Vrelians. They weren't calculating what would impress. They didn't have a meeting to coordinate their approach or a strategy session to figure out how to present themselves well. They just did what they were going to do anyway. And somehow, maybe because of that, maybe precisely because of that, what they were going to do anyway turned out to be the most remarkable thing any of the non-human observers on that ship had seen from us. It started with a simple structure. 2 lanes, a starting line, some kind of challenge, measure the result. But within about 20 minutes, it had evolved into something I can only describe as an organism. A living thing that humans collectively built in real time, adjusting and revising and arguing and laughing and trying things that didn't work, and immediately trying something else. The first event was the carry relay again, because it was the thing they'd been doing and it was good and they'd learned from the day before. But someone, I think it was Corporal Nakagawa, who had a gift for this kind of thing, suggested adding a problem to the route. A section where the carrier had to solve something while still carrying the person. A combination lock on a gate, 3 numbers. You had to get it right or backtrack. Simple, incredibly simple. The effect was immediate and visible. The relay went from a physical challenge to a physical cognitive challenge. And the change in the competition's character was profound. The strongest pair wasn't necessarily going to win anymore. The pair with the best communication under pressure. The one where the person being carried could read the lock and call out numbers while the carrier was moving, breathing hard, focusing on footing, that pair had the advantage now. Webb and Ferreira won that round. Because Ferreira, despite being the one getting carried, spent the whole carry phase with her head up, reading the environment, calling Webb's route. And when they hit the lock, she had 2 of the 3 numbers already, and she got the 3rd in the time it would have taken someone else to start focusing. coordination under pressure, in competition. I looked at Vethosel's face. His expression through the alien anatomy was difficult to read, but his posture had changed. The rigid formal bearing had shifted slightly. He was leaning forward, just by a degree or two, but it was there. Event 2 came from an argument. Specialist Tors, the one who'd had the technique dispute the day before, made the point that the relay format favored pairs who happened to be matched well in size and strength, and that was fine, but what if you made it so the pairs were randomly assigned? Then you couldn't plan for it. You had to adapt. There was a loud and immediate debate about this. Sergeant Kim said it wasn't fair if the random assignment was lopsided. What if a small person got paired with someone much larger? Tors said exactly, that's the point. Kim said explain. Tors said, in a real situation you don't get to choose who needs help. You don't get to pick conditions that favor you. You adapt to whatever you've got, so the game should test that. The argument lasted maybe 8 minutes. By the end of it, there was a compromise, random assignments, but the challenge would be structured so that different physical matchups had different natural advantages. Size didn't just make things harder. Sometimes it made certain approaches available that weren't available to differently sized pairs. This required redesigning the course, which took about 15 minutes of collaborative, chaotic, overlapping suggestion energy that I can only compare to watching a jazz ensemble that isn't playing from sheet music, but somehow arrives at something that works. Vethosel, during those 15 minutes, turned to one of his senior officers and said something in Vrelian that the translation buffer caught and rendered as, "They are designing the challenge in real time, in a group, without designated authority." His officer said something back. The buffer caught, "Yes, I'm watching it too." The random assignment relay was spectacular. Not because every pair performed well. Some of the random matchups were genuinely awkward, and those pairs struggled, and that was real and unfiltered, and the crowd reacted to it the way a crowd reacts when someone they like is having a hard time, with encouragement that got louder as the struggle got harder. It was spectacular because of how humans handled the bad matchups. There was one pair, Private First Class at Jora Mensa, who was 5'3" and weighed about 55 kilos, and Staff Sergeant Ray Okafor, who was 6'2" and built like a door, where the size differential was so significant that the carry was clearly going to be the challenge's primary difficulty. They got assigned to each other, and there was an audible ripple in the crowd. Mensa looked at Okafor, Okafor looked at Mensa. Then Mensa said, "Okay, you know what we're doing." "I have no idea," Okafor said. "You're carrying me and I'm your eyes. You keep your head down and focus on your feet and your breathing. I read everything else. We run our own pace. We don't try to compete with the other pairs. We compete with the course." Okafor thought about it. "That works." "It'll work if you trust me." "I trust you, Mensa." "Good, let's go." They didn't win. They weren't in the top 3. But they completed the course with a combination lock solve time that was in the top 2, because Mensa's eyes from her elevated position were remarkable and her code calling was sharp. And when they crossed the line, the crowd reaction was louder for them than it had been for the winning pair. Because the crowd understood what they'd done. The crowd understood that they'd taken a bad hand and found a way to play it with everything they had. Vethosel didn't say anything for a while after that. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "The crowd is reacting to the quality of the effort, not the outcome of the competition." Nobody answered him, but sub-analyst Presavai, who was documenting beside him, typed something into her recording buffer that she later told me was, "Note for report, human competitive crowds do not measure outcome alone. They appear to measure something else. Classification pending." Chapter 5, The Cathara Show UP. Here's the part I genuinely didn't see coming. On the second day of competition in Hangar Bay 7, about 3 hours in, the door opened and Sesmaravan walked in. Sesmaravan, who wrote the Notable Human Deficiencies section of the weekly integration report. Sesmaravan, who had used the phrase marginally acceptable performance envelope in 3 separate documents. Sesmaravan, the Cathara liaison with his 4 arms and his sensory cluster, and his reputation for a precise and unsparing assessment of everything he observed. He walked in alone, no junior staff, no recording equipment. Just him in his standard duty uniform, standing inside the door of Hangar Bay 7 and watching. Nobody invited him, he just came. I was standing near the door when he entered. We'd interacted enough that I was probably the most natural human to acknowledge him. Sesmaravan, I said. Sergeant Okonkwo. His translation collar rendered his voice in its usual measured tenor. I was informed there was an activity of note occurring here. It's a competition, I said. Multi-event, self-organized. His sensory cluster shifted, the Cathara equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Self-organized. Nobody assigned it. Nobody scheduled it. It just built itself. He watched for a moment. On the course, another relay pair was running, this one trying to navigate an equipment crate obstacle section while maintaining communication loud enough for their partner to track them. The purpose, Sesmaravan said, is to determine hierarchy. Partly, I said, honestly. Mostly to see what's possible. He looked at me, the sensory cluster did the eyebrow thing again. Clarify. Competing tells us things about ourselves that we can't figure out any other way, I said. Where the edges are. What happens when you're pushing against someone who's pushing back just as hard? You find out what you're actually made of, not what you think you are, what you actually are. Sesmaravan was quiet for a moment. And the knowledge gained from this, it is retained. Always. He watched another minute, then he said, may I remain and observe? As long as you want, I said. He found a place to stand, and he stayed. At some point in the early afternoon, by ship's time, this was about the 5th hour of the competition, Marcus Webb made a suggestion that changed the day. He proposed an event that wasn't a relay. He'd been thinking about it, he said. The relay was great, but everything so far was about pairs. What about something that tested a whole group? Something where the challenge was so complicated that you couldn't win with just 2 people, you needed everybody. The crowd liked this. The crowd immediately started arguing about what it should be, which meant they were already designing it because that's what humans do. The argument and the design are the same process. What they landed on, after a sprawling conversation that involved at least 12 simultaneous sub-debates and somehow coalesced into a structure anyway, was this. A team of 15 humans, a course that was divided into segments, each requiring different skills. The team had to cover the whole course, but they could assign any team member to any segment, and here was the key. The assignment had to happen before the course started, without knowing the exact conditions of each segment. They'd see the segments, but not the specific challenges within them. They had to predict. They had to know their people well enough to put the right person in the right place before they knew exactly what the right place would need. It was, in other words, a test of knowing each other. It was a test of whether a group of humans, given a complex unknown problem, could self-organize in a way that used everyone's strengths. The name for this kind of thing in military doctrine is adaptive resource allocation under uncertainty. It's considered an advanced skill. It's something you train for. It's something that takes teams years to develop. Marcus Webb came up with it on the spot as a game to play during downtime. Sesmaravan watched the team organize for about 10 minutes. I watched Sesmaravan. His sensory cluster was active in a way I hadn't seen before, the Cathara equivalent of a human leaning forward, all attention engaged. He was watching the team argue about assignments. He was watching them point at segments and gesture and counter-gesture, and push back and give way and revise their plan 3 times in 5 minutes. He turned to me. How do they determine authority, he asked, for the decisions who has final say? In this, nobody really. They argue until something wins. How does something win? It's the idea that makes the most sense to the most people, or sometimes it's the person who argues best, or sometimes someone with direct experience in a relevant area speaks up and people defer. It's fluid. Fluid, he repeated, with the tone of someone writing down a word they're not sure they understand. Different decision for different situations, same group. He was quiet for a while. Then, this is how you function in unstructured environments. Pretty much. And in structured environments, you function differently. Yeah, we can do hierarchy when hierarchy is what's needed. We can do flat when flat is what's needed. We sort of read the situation. Sesmaravan's 4 arms moved slightly, the Cathara equivalent of a slow exhale. I have been assessing human performance in structured environments. I have not sufficiently weighted performance in unstructured ones. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to push it. He said it himself. That is an error in my methodology. Chapter 6, the main event. It was on the third day. The third day happened because nobody wanted to stop. The competition had taken on a life of its own, more events, more participants, structures that were evolving in real time. Someone had started keeping a record. Someone else had designed a rough bracket. Someone had created rules for disputes that everyone agreed were good rules despite the fact that they'd been written on the back of a ration wrapper. By the third day, it wasn't just Vrelians and one Cathara watching. Commander HFY Sci-Fi was there, with his translation buffer and 3 members of his staff. 6 Peloran, who communicated in color patterns and had been communicating in very intense color patterns since the second day when they'd managed to observe some of the relay events. Even 2 of the blue guys, the ones whose name I can't pronounce, were there, standing near the back of the hangar in the careful way of beings who weren't sure if they were welcome but needed to be present anyway. The observation area, which had started as Vethosel, and 4 officers standing to one side, had become something else. It was a mixed species cluster of senior observers standing or sitting or adopting whatever posture their biology used for attentive watching, all focused on the same painted lines and the humans organizing around them. Marcus Webb stood at the starting end of the course and looked at this crowd, and then he looked at Ferreira and then back at the crowd. "No pressure," Ferreira said. "Right," Marcus said. "No pressure." What they ran on the third day was the team event. 4 teams of 15. The full group challenge, segmented course, pre-assignment, no knowing the exact conditions until you're in them. 15 minutes of planning per team, then the run. Vethosel had, at some point in the previous 24 hours, requested that human competition staff explain the rules to him in full so that he could properly assess what was happening. He understood the structure. He had, Joss Murren told me later, spent 2 hours the previous night reviewing documentation on human group dynamics, decision theory, and what humans called team chemistry, which he described as a concept with no satisfactory parallel in Vrelian operational doctrine. He stood at the edge of the course with his arms behind his back and his compound eyes tracking everything. The first team ran. They were competent. They'd assigned their people carefully. There was a segment involving a technical disassembly-reassembly task that they'd correctly predicted would favor fine motor skills specialists, and their assignment to that segment was good. They had a rough patch in the communication relay section, a segment where information had to be passed along a chain of people without direct communication, but they recovered. Total time, 8 minutes and 41 seconds. Polite applause from the human crowd. The alien observers processed this without visible reaction. The second team ran. They were faster. They'd made aggressive assignment choices, and most of them paid off. Their rough patch was in the problem-solving segment, a structure that required spatial reasoning under time pressure where their assigned specialist struggled. The rest of the team couldn't help because of the rules. She worked through it, slower than the other team's specialist. But she worked through it, and they came out the other side. Total time, 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Louder applause, a ripple in the alien observation area. The third team, Marcus Webb's team, ran third. I want to describe this precisely. Webb's team had spent their planning session in a way that had confused some observers, including apparently Vethosel, because they'd spent the first 8 minutes not talking about the course. They'd been talking to each other, about things that seemed unrelated, about what people were good at. Not in the narrow skill sense, not Nakagawa is fast, or Mensa has good eyes, but in a deeper sense. What did each person do when things went wrong? How did each person handle pressure? Who got better under stress, and who needed support under stress? It was a planning session that was also a conversation. That was also, in some strange way, a moment of care, making sure every single person on that team felt known going into the run. Webb gave the final assignments with 3 minutes left. He didn't justify them. He didn't defend them. He stated them like facts, and the team, having had that conversation, having felt heard, trusted them. They ran. The first 3 segments were textbook. Fast, clean, no hesitation. The alien observers were watching with the full engagement of beings who understood by now that something significant was happening. The rough patch came in segment 6, the communication chain. One of the team members, Private Ajora Mensa, who'd been part of the size-mismatched pair on day 2, was in the middle of the communication chain, and the message she received from her left was garbled. Not just partially unclear, genuinely corrupted. The game rules said you couldn't ask for repetition. You passed on what you received or you made your best judgment call. She paused for just a second. You could see it. Then she made a judgment call. She looked at the message she'd received, corrupted as it was, and she thought about what the team needed, and she made her best judgment of what the intent was and passed it forward. The message reached the end of the chain. The team member at the end looked at it, processed it, made a decision. It was the right decision. Not because Mensa's judgment had been perfect, because the message she'd constructed from the garbled input and her knowledge of her team's situation was close enough that the person at the end could figure out the rest. They came out of segment 6 and hit the final stretch, and Webb, who'd been the anchor for the whole run, took over, and they crossed the line at 7 minutes and 52 seconds. The noise in Hangar Bay 7 was extraordinary. I was watching Vethasil when they crossed the line. He was still, the way a being is still when they're processing something that is reorganizing their understanding at a fundamental level. His compound eyes were moving, tracking, recording, but his posture was absolutely motionless. Then HFY beside him did something I had never seen a Serath Compact senior officer do in my 18 months aboard the Meridian Compact. He put one hand on the ventilation rail in front of him and leaned forward and said, through his translation buffer, a single word. Remarkable. Chapter 7, After the Line. Marcus Webb crossed the finish line and raised both arms, and the team piled into each other in the way of people who have just done something hard together and can't quite believe it. And then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, Marcus looked up. Not at the scoreboard someone had rigged to a cargo display panel. Not at the crowd. Not at Ferreira, who was already walking toward him. He looked at Vethasil. Just for a second. Like he'd been aware the whole time that someone important was watching and had never once performed for it, but was now acknowledging that the moment was shared. Vethasil held the eye contact. Then the Vrelian field commander did something that his own culture would have considered unusual. That, I'm told, his own reports reflected on at some length later. He put his hands together in front of him, the way humans do when they applaud, but without the sound, a closed, held gesture. It wasn't his species' gesture of acknowledgement, it was ours. He'd learned it at some point in the previous 3 days, and he used it in the only language he thought Marcus Webb would understand without a translation buffer. Marcus stared at him for a moment, then he returned the gesture. I had to look away, I'm not sure why. My eyes were doing something inconvenient. Chapter 8, What Came After. There were meetings, of course. There are always meetings. Vethasil requested a formal debrief with Colonel Voss that lasted 3 hours. Sesmaravan submitted a revised methodology statement for the human integration assessment that, among other changes, removed the phrase marginally acceptable performance envelope from consideration as a standard metric. HFY Sci-Fi, whose species communicated through bioluminescent skin patterns, produced a pattern that his own staff described as the equivalent of deeply sustained admiration, a pattern typically reserved for witnessing acts of long-term cultural achievement. He'd produced it watching humans play a game they'd invented on a painted floor in a cargo bay in 3 days. Sub-analyst Joss Murren's final report on the Hangar Bay 7 events became required reading in the Vrelian Xenobehavioral Analysis curriculum. She amended her opening lines several times in drafts. The final published version opened. I was tasked with documenting human rest cycle behavior. I observed something that may require us to reconsider what we have been measuring, and why, and whether our instruments are calibrated for the right qualities. The Notable Human Deficiencies section of Sesmaravan's weekly integration report was renamed. He changed it to Areas of Continued Development, then, 2 reports later, to Developmental Observations. By the end of the month, the section had been moved to an appendix, and the main body of the report focused on what he called Observed Adaptive Capacity Indicators, which was Cathara professional language for things that surprised me. Colonel Voss called me into her office 2 weeks after Hangar Bay 7. She looked like she'd been sleeping better. There was a quality to her expression I hadn't seen much in 18 months, something that wasn't quite relaxed, but was something adjacent to it. Something like having set down a weight she'd been carrying for a while. "Sit down, Delia," she said. She only used my first name when it was real. I sat. Vethossel requested a joint training exercise, she said. Designed by both human and Vrelian planning teams equally. First one in cooperative history where the design authority is fully shared between an established species and a Tier 3 integration candidate. I stared at her. "I know," she said. I know. Colonel, Delia," she held up a hand. "I need you to maintain some composure because I need to finish telling you this, and I am also actively working on my own composure, so let's both just breathe." I breathed. "Additionally," she said, "Sesmaravan has recommended that the third formal integration fitness review be postponed. Not cancelled, postponed. He's proposing that the review criteria themselves need revision before the review is conducted. He's saying the test was wrong. He's saying the test wasn't measuring the right things." She paused. "Which is almost better, honestly, because it means the 18 months we've spent looking inadequate were 18 months spent being measured by the wrong ruler." I thought about Marcus Webb rolling his neck on the yellow line. About Adjora Mensa trusting her judgment call in the middle of a corrupted communication chain. About Vethossel putting his hands together in a gesture that wasn't his. "What do we do now?" I asked. Voss looked at me for a moment. "We keep competing," she said. "It's what we do. It's apparently what we've always done." And apparently the galaxy needed to see it. Epilogue, what MARCUS said. 3 days after the meeting with Voss, I found Marcus Webb in Hangar Bay 7 alone. He was repainting the yellow lines they'd gotten scuffed during the competition, with careful strokes of a paint applicator, kneeling on the floor in his duty uniform with the methodical attention of someone who cared about doing a small thing correctly. I stood in the doorway for a moment. "You know what you started," I said. He looked up. "Ma'am." "The competition, what it turned into, you know." He thought about it, set down the paint applicator. "I know some of it." "It changed things, Marcus." I said his name intentionally, the way Voss had said mine when she needed me to understand something was real. Not just for the crew, for the whole integration assessment, for what the cooperative thinks about us. He looked at the yellow lines, then he looked up at me. He started, then stopped. "I just thought we needed something to push against. You know, something to measure ourselves against that was real, not a simulator, not a drill, something real where you find out what you can actually do." "Yeah," I said. "I didn't think the whole galaxy was going to watch." "Nobody ever does," I said. "That's kind of the whole point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the paint applicator and went back to the lines. "They good?" I asked, meaning the Vrelians, the Cathara, all of them. He considered. "I think they just hadn't seen it before," he said. "That thing where you find out what you're made of, I don't think they have a word for it." "Maybe they do now." He smiled at the floor. "Yeah, maybe." I walked back out into the corridor. The ship hummed around me, 9,000 beings from 15 species going about their lives in the dark between stars. Above us, through 17 decks of durasteel and atmospheric membrane, and the physics of a vessel moving faster than light should allow, there was nothing but space. And somewhere in the files of the Galactic Cooperative's Xenobehavioral Archive, in the formal record of 17 reviewed species across 400 years of integration history, Joss Murren's report had just added a new classification. Human Competitive Behavior Category Designation, Transformative. Further study recommended. Note, standard measurement instruments may be insufficient. Recommend developing new instruments. New instruments. After 400 years and 17 species, the galaxy needed new instruments. Because we showed up with paint and a stopwatch and a kid from Tulsa who needed something to push against. And we pushed.